What if history does not begin where we were taught it does? What if the first chapters of being human were not erased in fire or conquest, but softened by time itself, allowed to dissolve so gently that forgetting felt like a natural act rather than a loss? There is a long quiet stretching behind us, not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of missing sound. Hundreds of thousands of years in which human bodies walked, breathed, hunted, buried their dead, and yet left behind almost nothing that speaks clearly of how they understood themselves. Bones remain, stones remain. But intention fades, meaning evaporates, and in that emptiness the absence begins to feel deliberate, even if no hand can be seen, and before you allow your body to sink fully into this calm, take a very small moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if something in what I'm sharing makes you want to stay a little longer. If you wish, share the place and time where you are listening. I'm always curious about the small points of light drifting together in the night. Modern timelines tell us that Homo sapiens have existed for at least 300,000 years. That number appears in textbooks calmly, without weight. 300,000 years. And yet, nearly all that time is treated as a prelude without substance, a long corridor before the real story begins. According to the accepted narrative, meaningful culture arrives suddenly and late. Language sharpens, art appears, ritual takes shape, memory becomes external, and then, almost immediately, history starts. But something about that pacing feels uneven. Civilizations do not usually awaken from nothing fully formed. Minds do not suddenly bloom after sleeping for hundreds of millennia. When change happens in nature, it leaves traces. When silence follows abundance, it raises questions. Archaeology offers us fragments rather than continuity. A handprint on cave stone, a burial with red ochre, a carved figurine whose purpose we can only guess. These objects are often described as the first sparks of symbolic thought, but the framing itself is revealing. First sparks imply long darkness before, yet darkness, when examined closely, often turns out to be smoke rather than emptiness. Consider how much effort is required for knowledge to survive. Oral memory demands repetition. Symbolic systems require consensus. Complex skills demand teaching across generations. It is difficult to imagine that early humans existed for tens of thousands of years without repeatedly crossing these thresholds, only to retreat from them again. And yet, that is what the silence implies. Not one loss, but many. There are gaps that feel wider than erosion alone can explain. Tools appear, improve, then plateau. Populations spread, then thin. Genetic bottlenecks hint at near-extinction events, moments when humanity was reduced to a fragile thread. Climate records speak of violent swings, of ice advancing and retreating, of coastlines swallowed and reborn. Each of these disruptions could erase memory without malice. But taken together, they suggest a rhythm of forgetting built into our past. What makes the question heavier is not that disasters occurred, but that recovery seems too clean. After chaos, knowledge usually returns unevenly, carrying scars. Yet, when the archaeological record resumes with clarity, it does so with confidence. Structures appear with alignment. Societies organize with rules. Symbol systems arrive already coherent. It feels less like a slow awakening and more like remembering something half forgotten. Some researchers have pointed quietly to this imbalance. Not loudly, not conspiratorially, but with careful language. They note how the so-called cognitive revolution appears abrupt, how the archaeological record behaves less like a smooth curve and more like a broken waveform. How absence is often explained away rather than examined. And then there is the human tendency to simplify origins. Beginnings comfort us. They provide anchors. If history begins at a clear point, then everything before it can be safely blurred. Prehistory becomes a holding space for uncertainty, a place where questions are suspended rather than pursued. The longer that space is left unexamined, the easier it becomes to treat it as empty. But prehistory was lived time. It contained fear and curiosity, loss and learning. It contained parents teaching children how to shape stone, how to track seasons, how to bury the dead with care. Those acts leave impressions on the mind even when they leave little on the ground. The idea that all of this unfolded without layered meaning feels less like evidence and more like convenience. There's also the matter of scale. When knowledge is lost today, even partially, traces linger. Stories fracture but survive, symbols degrade but echo. Yet when we look backward, entire epochs appear to vanish without residue. This raises a quiet question. Are we looking at what remains, or only at what fits our expectations of what should remain? Histories are not only shaped by what happened, but by what can be measured. Stone survives better than wood. Bones outlast breath. Fire preserves clay but erases fibre. Over time, survival becomes selection, and selection, repeated enough, begins to resemble intention, even when it is not. Still, the sense persists that something more fragile than material was lost. Ways of seeing, ways of organising thought, perhaps even ways of remembering time itself. If early humans understood their world cyclically rather than linearly, much of their knowledge may have been designed to dissolve, not endure. And if later societies favoured permanence, they may have mistaken ephemerality for absence. What remains unsettling is not the lack of proof, but the lack of curiosity about the lack. The long corridor behind us is treated as a simple waiting room rather than a place where entire worlds may have risen and fallen quietly. The question is not whether civilizations like ours existed before history, but whether complexity must always look like us to be recognized. As you listen, perhaps you can feel that corridor stretching backward, dimly lit, lined not with ruins but with footsteps fading into soft ground. Each step once belonged to someone who believed they were living in a complete world, not a prologue. Each breath carried assumptions about reality that may never be recovered, and if that is true, then history does not begin with writing or monuments. It begins wherever memory fails. The moment something essential slips beyond recall, a boundary forms. On one side, story. On the other, silence. The question that lingers is not what happened before history, but how many times history has already happened, and quietly let itself be forgotten. Silence rarely remains untouched. Over time, it invites interpretation, then assumption, and eventually certainty. What begins as an unanswered question slowly hardens into a conclusion, not because evidence appears, but because discomfort fades. The second layer of this long forgetting is not emptiness, but acceptance, the quiet agreement that nothing important could have existed there. Yet when attention drifts back toward the earliest human traces, contradictions begin to surface. They do not announce themselves loudly. They sit patiently in the margins of research, in footnotes, in cautious phrasing. They appear as anomalies that are acknowledged, then gently set aside. One such tension lies in the nature of the human mind itself. According to the prevailing view, anatomical modernity arrived long before behavioural modernity. Bodies capable of speech, abstraction, and complex emotion existed tens of thousands of years before those capacities were supposedly expressed. The implication is subtle but profound, that the human mind waited, dormant, for a signal it could not generate on its own. This idea has always been uneasy. Brains are metabolically expensive. Evolution does not typically produce excess capacity without pressure to use it. Neural structures capable of symbolic thought, planning across generations, and moral reasoning would not simply idle for millennia. If they existed, they were exercised. And if they were exercised, they shaped worlds that left impressions, if not in stone, then in behaviour. The archaeological record, however, presents a puzzle. For long stretches, tools remain simple. Variation is minimal. Innovation appears slow. And then, suddenly, change accelerates. Symbolic objects emerge. Burials grow elaborate. Art appears not as hesitant scribbles, but as confident expression. It is tempting to call this a beginning, but it may be more accurate to call it a reappearance. Consider how fragile cultural transmission can be. Knowledge does not only require invention, it requires continuity. Break the chain often enough, and even the most sophisticated systems collapse into fragments. A single generation without teachers can erase techniques refined over centuries. Multiply that vulnerability across climatic shocks, migrations, population collapses and isolation, and loss becomes inevitable. Genetic studies quietly reinforce this instability. They speak of bottlenecks, moments when the human population shrank dramatically. In some reconstructions, the number of breeding individuals fell to levels that would threaten any complex culture. Survival would have taken precedence over memory. Skills not essential to immediate life would have faded first. And yet, even in these narrow passages, something endured. Social bonds, care for the injured, patterns of cooperation that exceed what raw survival demands. These are not primitive instincts alone. They are learned behaviours, rehearsed and reinforced. They hint at traditions deeper than the material record can preserve. What complicates the picture further is the universality of certain patterns. Across distant regions, separated by geography and time, similar symbolic forms emerge. Spirals, handprints, rhythmic repetition. These are often interpreted as independent inventions. But repetition can also be a sign of inheritance, not of objects, but of ways of thinking. Language deepens the mystery. Fully formed speech requires structure, grammar, abstraction, and shared metaphor. It is one of the most complex systems humans possess, and yet its origins leave almost no trace. There is no gradual fossil record of syntax, no partial grammar preserved in sediment. Language appears as an all-or-nothing phenomenon. Either it exists or it does not. If language existed earlier than we assume, its disappearance would leave almost nothing behind. Spoken words do not fossilize. Stories vanish with the last voice that remembers them. Entire cosmologies could dissolve without leaving a single mark in stone. The silence we observe may not be the absence of meaning, but the absence of medium. There is also the question of how knowledge was valued. Modern societies externalize memory aggressively. We write, record, store. We assume that importance demands permanence, but this assumption may not be universal. Some cultures preserve meaning through ritual repetition rather than durable objects. Others encode memory in landscape, in movement, in seasonal return. Remove the people, and the knowledge evaporates. Over time, scholars have noted that what we call simple tools often require complex understanding to produce. Stone knapping, for example, is not intuitive. It demands foresight, precision, and an understanding of fracture mechanics. These skills are taught, not guessed. They imply long chains of instruction that stretch beyond what is visible. The question then becomes uncomfortable. How much has been mislabeled as primitive simply because it does not resemble us? Complexity that does not culminate in cities or writing is easily overlooked. Intelligence expressed without hierarchy or monument does not announce itself to excavation. There is a subtle bias at work, not intentional, but persistent. History favours what endures. It privileges weight over movement, walls over relationships, permanence over process. Anything designed to flow rather than stand is easily missed, and yet flowing systems can be extraordinarily sophisticated. As this second layer settles into view, the earlier silence begins to feel less empty and more selective. Not a void, but a filter. What passed through it were stones and bones. What remained behind were songs, gestures, shared meanings. all the things that require living bodies to exist. Perhaps the greatest loss before history was not technology or architecture, but continuity. The unbroken thread of memory that allows one generation to know itself as part of a longer story. When that thread breaks often enough, each restart feels like a beginning. And so the question shifts. Instead of asking when humanity became human, it may be worth asking how many times humanity forgot itself, and what traces of those forgotten selves still echo faintly beneath the surface of what we call the first awakening. If memory can fracture, then landscapes become its last witnesses. Long after voices fade, the ground remembers pressure, weight, repetition. Stone carries habits. Soil preserves interruptions. And sometimes, when attention lingers long enough, the earth reveals signs of activity that do not fit the tempo we expect from a forgotten past. There are places where this tension becomes impossible to ignore. Sites that appear too early, too deliberate, too coordinated for the stories built around them. They do not shout. They simply exist, immovable, asking their questions through silence. One such place sits on a limestone ridge, overlooking a horizon that once felt far less stable than it does today. Its pillars are carved with animals rendered in confident lines. Foxes, snakes, birds, creatures observed closely enough to be stylized without losing essence. The stones are heavy, shaped, arranged with intention. And yet, the people who built this place are not supposed to have been capable of such organization. According to established timelines, they were hunter-gatherers, nomadic, temporarily settled at best. They had no agriculture, no pottery, no writing, and still they raised architecture that required planning, labor coordination, and symbolic cohesion. This inversion unsettles the sequence we rely on: monument before village, ritual before farming, meaning before surplus. The response to this inversion has been cautious. Explanations emerge that preserve the larger framework. Exceptional circumstances, unique motivations, a singular experiment that went nowhere. The site becomes an anomaly rather than a clue. But anomalies, when isolated carefully enough, stop threatening the pattern that surrounds them. Yet this is not an isolated case. Elsewhere, submerged coastlines reveal traces of habitation older than the shorelines we know. Stone tools appear beneath layers that suggest long-lost landscapes, drowned when ice retreated and seas rose. Entire regions once walked by humans now lie beyond easy reach, buried under water and time. When sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age, coastlines shifted dramatically. What was once fertile land vanished. What was once central became peripheral. Populations were forced inland, settlements dissolved. And with them, memory fractured again. If early complexity existed along those shores, it would have been erased not by destruction, but by submersion. This possibility is uncomfortable because it suggests that absence is not proof, that what we do not see may simply lie where we are not looking. The archaeological record then becomes not a complete archive, but a biased sample shaped by geology as much as by human behaviour. There is also the matter of intention. Why build monumental spaces without permanent settlement? One answer points toward ritual, toward gatherings that were seasonal rather than continuous, toward societies that invested their energy not in accumulation, but in convergence. Knowledge shared intensely, then released back into dispersal. Such systems would leave little behind. No trash layers, no continuous habitation, only moments of density followed by long silence. From a modern perspective, this looks like simplicity, but from another angle it may represent a different optimization, one that valued resilience through mobility rather than permanence. If this is so, then early human societies may have been complex in ways that resist fossilization. Their sophistication may have lived in coordination, timing, shared myth, and ritual performance. These are systems that collapse cleanly when disrupted. Nothing crumbles, nothing burns, they simply stop happening. Over time, As climate stabilized and populations grew denser, permanence became advantageous. Memory externalized. Structures thickened. Symbols hardened into marks. History, as we recognize it, emerged not because intelligence appeared, but because continuity finally held. This reframing alters the emotional weight of early monuments. They are no longer the first attempts at meaning, but the last echoes of something already ancient. Not beginnings, but reminders. Anchors placed deliberately, perhaps, in a world that was becoming unstable. What is striking is how often these early sites emphasize animals, cycles, and repetition. Not rulers, not conquest, not lineage. The focus feels cosmological rather than political, as though these places were designed to orient communities within a larger rhythm rather than to dominate territory. If so, then their disappearance is not mysterious. Systems built on shared presence rather than enforced control are fragile. Remove the rhythm and the structure loses relevance. Remove the gathering and the stone becomes mute. The deeper question is why these patterns recur, why early human traces so often suggest awareness without accumulation, complexity without hierarchy, purpose without permanence. It challenges the assumption that progress moves in a single direction toward density, storage, and control. Perhaps there were multiple paths available to early humans. Some led toward what we now recognize as civilization. Others led elsewhere, toward ways of living that left almost nothing behind. When those paths ended, they did not fail. They simply stopped being walked. As you sit with this thought, the image of early humanity shifts. No longer stumbling forward blindly, but navigating choices, adapting to conditions, sometimes abandoning systems that no longer fit. In that light, what we call prehistory becomes a series of experiments, many of which succeeded on their own terms, even if they did not survive. And so the question sharpens again. If complexity existed before history, not as a straight line, but as a field of possibilities, how much of our past has been lost not to catastrophe, but to decisions, quiet, practical, human decisions, to let certain ways of knowing go? What if the ground beneath us is not hiding a single forgotten civilization, but many brief worlds, each complete while it lasted, each dissolving without trace, leaving behind only the faint suggestion that history has always been more crowded than it appears? When the earth changes its mind, memory rarely survives intact, not because it is deliberately erased, but because it is scattered, folded into layers that no longer speak the same language. The fourth layer of this long inquiry settles into the rhythms of the planet itself, into forces older and less attentive than human intention. There is evidence, quiet but persistent, that the world experienced periods of violent instability long before written records began. Ice advanced where forests once stood. Deserts replaced grasslands. Oceans rose not gradually, but in pulses, swallowing coastlines in generations rather than millennia. These were not subtle shifts. They were rearrangements. For communities living close to the land, such changes would have been catastrophic. Rivers that once guided movement would have vanished or changed course. Familiar animals would have migrated or disappeared. Seasonal markers would have drifted out of alignment. Knowledge passed down carefully over generations could become suddenly useless, and yet these disruptions are often described as background conditions rather than central actors. Climate is treated as a stage, not a force with agency. But when examined closely, it behaves more like a sensor, deciding which stories survive and which dissolve. One of the most striking patterns in early human dispersal is its correspondence with environmental corridors. Migration does not follow curiosity alone, it follows opportunity. As ice retreated, pathways opened. As seas rose, routes closed. Entire populations were redirected without warning. In such moments, survival would have demanded adaptation at the cost of continuity. The geological record preserves hints of abrupt cooling events, sudden warming, and periods of atmospheric volatility. These shifts did not occur in isolation. They overlapped with moments when human populations appear to thin dramatically. Genetic evidence suggests near collapse followed by expansion. Each contraction would have narrowed not only gene pools but memory itself. When populations shrink, traditions concentrate. When they expand again, those traditions fragment. What returns is not what existed before, but a simplified version, stripped of elements that no longer fit the new world. Over time, repeated cycles of collapse and recovery would produce a past that feels strangely shallow, even if it was once deep. There are stories embedded in many ancient cultures that speak of darkness, cold, fire, and flood. These are often interpreted metaphorically or dismissed as myth. But myth, when it repeats across continents, may be memory compressed beyond recognition. Not a record of dates or names, but of sensation, fear, loss, displacement. If early humans experienced environmental shocks severe enough to fracture continuity multiple times, then prehistory becomes less a straight road and more a braided river. Channels splitting, rejoining, disappearing underground, resurfacing altered. Each branch carries fragments of what came before, but none carry the whole. What complicates this picture is the speed at which adaptation appears to occur afterward. Once conditions stabilize, complexity returns rapidly. Settlements form, symbol systems proliferate, social structures harden. It is as though humanity repeatedly rehearsed the act of beginning again, drawing from an internal reservoir rather than inventing from scratch. This internal reservoir may not consist of specific technologies, but of patterns, ways of organizing groups, intuitions about cycles and balance, a sense of orientation within a larger order. These are resilient forms of knowledge. They survive disruption better than tools or buildings because they live in behavior. But even these patterns degrade under pressure. After enough disruption, orientation gives way to improvisation. The horizon narrows. Long-term thinking becomes a liability when the ground itself is unreliable. Under such conditions, cultures may deliberately shed complexity, choosing flexibility over memory. This possibility reframes early humanity not as a species slowly waking up, but as one repeatedly forced to simplify itself, intelligence constrained by instability, wisdom sacrificed to immediacy. Not because it was absent, but because it became dangerous to carry too much of the past into an unpredictable future. When stability finally returned for longer stretches, the effect would have been profound. Knowledge that had been held tentatively could settle. Practices once abandoned could be rebuilt. The suddenness of cultural flowering would then reflect not innovation, but release, pressure lifting after long compression. This may explain why early complex expressions appear fully confident rather than experimental. Art does not stumble. Ritual does not hesitate. Architecture aligns with celestial cycles immediately. These acts suggest familiarity, not discovery, as though the mind had been waiting for permission to remember. There is a subtle melancholy in this interpretation. It suggests that much of what we consider human progress emerges not from accumulation, but from survival through loss. That intelligence has often been shaped by what it could not afford to retain. That forgetting may be as fundamental to our story as learning. As you let this settle, imagine generations watching the world become unfamiliar, watching landmarks vanish, watching seasons shift, teaching children rules that no longer apply. Then, later, teaching grandchildren fragments of older rules that might become useful again someday. In such a world, history would not be linear, it would be episodic. Knowledge would not build upward, but inward, condensing into instincts and stories that feel timeless because they have been repeated so often. The lingering question, then, is not whether catastrophe erased early civilizations, but whether catastrophe trained humanity to live without leaving deep traces, whether adaptation itself became a form of erasure, and if so, how much of what we call the beginning of history is simply the moment when the Earth finally allowed us to remember ourselves for longer than a few generations at a time. If memory depends on stability, and stability is rare, then the silence before history may not mark ignorance, but endurance. When memory fractures often enough, it begins to speak in metaphor, not because truth has vanished, but because precision has become unsafe. The fifth layer drifts into this territory, where recurrence replaces record, and where the same story surfaces again and again, altered just enough to survive new landscapes. Across distant cultures, separated by oceans and millennia, there are echoes of overwhelming water, of land lost beneath rising seas, of chosen survivors carrying fragments of knowledge into an emptied world. These stories appear without coordination, yet they rhyme with unsettling consistency. They are rarely identical. Names change, settings shift, but the emotional architecture remains stable. Warning, disbelief, destruction, renewal. Such narratives are often treated as imaginative coincidence or moral allegory. And yet, coincidence grows less convincing as repetition increases. Flood traditions appear not once or twice, but dozens of times, embedded in societies with no clear contact. They persist even where floods are not common. They survive in environments where memory itself is fragile. Geology offers a quiet counterpart to these tales. At the end of the last ice age, global sea levels rose dramatically, not as a slow, gentle tide, but in pulses. Meltwater surged, coastlines retreated, estuaries vanished. For communities living near water, the world would have appeared to betray its own boundaries. What was solid became fluid. What was permanent became negotiable. This was not a single event. It unfolded unevenly, sometimes catastrophically. Entire regions that had supported human life for thousands of years disappeared beneath the surface. The people who lived there did not leave ruins behind. Their homes were taken intact, preserved only as absence. If cultural centres existed along these drowned margins, their loss would not have been gradual. It would have been sudden, disorienting, and emotionally overwhelming. Survivors would have carried not only grief, but urgency, a sense that something essential had to be preserved before the next wave arrived. In such moments, story becomes technology. Narrative compresses experience into transportable form. Details dissolve, but meaning survives. A flood becomes a symbol not only of water, but of rupture itself. A vessel becomes continuity. A chosen remnant becomes memory's last defense. Over generations, these stories would adapt. They would attach to local rivers, local mountains, local gods. They would shift from record to ritual, from warning to identity. And eventually they would be labelled myth, not because they were false, but because their original reference had slipped beneath recognition. What is rarely asked is why flood stories endure when so many other ancient narratives fade. Perhaps because they encode a lesson that never becomes obsolete, that the world can reset without asking permission, and that survival depends as much on letting go as on holding fast. There is also a subtler pattern within these accounts. The survivors are rarely portrayed as conquerors or builders of empires. They are caretakers, carriers, figures tasked not with domination, but with remembrance. This emphasis suggests that what was feared most was not physical destruction, but the loss of continuity. If that fear was justified, then the memory of repeated inundation may have shaped early human priorities deeply. Mobility would have been valued over permanence, oral tradition over fixed record, redundancy over accumulation. These choices would make societies resilient, but archaeologically invisible. Over time, as waters stabilized and shorelines settled into recognizable forms, new communities would emerge inland. Their ancestors' stories would persist, but their contexts would not. Without visible ruins to anchor them, These narratives would feel abstract, symbolic, easy to reinterpret. Later civilizations, encountering these stories without geological understanding, would reshape them again. Moral frameworks would be layered atop environmental memory. Punishment would replace process. Divine intention would replace climatic mechanism. The story would survive, but its original meaning would drift further away. What remains haunting is not whether these stories describe a single flood or many. It is the implication that loss on a planetary scale was familiar enough to be remembered everywhere, that forgetting was not an exception, but an expectation. This challenges the comforting notion that humanity steadily accumulates wisdom. Instead, it suggests cycles of knowing and unknowing, periods when memory expands, followed by contraction so severe that only compressed symbols survive. In this light, myth becomes not fiction, but residue. There is a temptation to search for a single source, a single drowned civilization whose destruction seeded all later legends. But this may be another simplification. Repetition does not require origin, it requires recurrence. Similar conditions produce similar responses. Similar losses produce similar stories. If human communities repeatedly found themselves watching familiar land vanish beneath water, they would repeatedly encode that experience into narrative. Each telling would be shaped by local context, but the core sensation would remain intact. Over time, this would produce a global chorus rather than a single voice. As you sit with these thoughts, imagine generations living with the expectation of erasure, teaching children not only how to hunt or gather, but how to release attachment, how to move when the ground betrays you, how to carry meaning lightly enough that it can survive relocation. In such a world, permanence would feel dangerous, stability would be suspect, knowledge would be designed to travel, not to anchor. What we now interpret as simplicity may have been an advanced response to an unstable planet, and when eventually stability returned for longer spans, those habits would not vanish overnight. The reflex to avoid permanence would linger. Only gradually would humans risk building structures meant to last. Only gradually would memory externalize again. This leaves a final, uneasy question hovering at the edge of this layer. If our earlier stories are shaped by repeated loss, if they carry warnings rather than triumphs, then what else might they be telling us? Not about the past, but about patterns that have not finished repeating. If the silence before history is filled with water and movement, with departure rather than construction, then perhaps history begins not when humans learn to build, but when they dare to believe the world will stay long enough to remember what they make. When memory fractures often enough, it begins to speak in metaphor, not because truth has vanished, but because precision has become unsafe. The fifth layer drifts into this territory, where occurrence replaces record, and where the same story surfaces again and again, altered just enough to survive new landscapes. Across distant cultures, separated by oceans and millennia, there are echoes of overwhelming water, of land lost beneath rising seas, of chosen survivors carrying fragments of knowledge into an emptied world. These stories appear without coordination, yet they rhyme with unsettling consistency. They are rarely identical. Names change, settings shift. But the emotional architecture remains stable. Warning, disbelief, destruction, renewal. Such narratives are often treated as imaginative coincidence or moral allegory, and yet coincidence grows less convincing as repetition increases. Flood traditions appear not once or twice, but dozens of times, embedded in societies with no clear contact. They persist even where floods are not common. They survive in environments where memory itself is fragile. Geology offers a quiet counterpart to these tales. At the end of the last ice age, global sea levels rose dramatically, not as a slow, gentle tide, but in pulses. Meltwater surged, coastlines retreated, estuaries vanished. For communities living near water, The world would have appeared to betray its own boundaries. What was solid became fluid. What was permanent became negotiable. This was not a single event. It unfolded unevenly, sometimes catastrophically. Entire regions that had supported human life for thousands of years disappeared beneath the surface. The people who lived there did not leave ruins behind. Their homes were taken intact, preserved only as absence. If cultural centres existed along these drowned margins, their loss would not have been gradual. It would have been sudden, disorienting, and emotionally overwhelming. Survivors would have carried not only grief, but urgency, a sense that something essential had to be preserved before the next wave arrived. In such moments, story becomes technology. Narrative compresses experience into transportable form. Details dissolve, but meaning survives. A flood becomes a symbol not only of water, but of rupture itself. A vessel becomes continuity. A chosen remnant becomes memory's last defense. Over generations, these stories would adapt. They would attach to local rivers, local mountains, local gods. They would shift from record to ritual, from warning to identity. And eventually they would be labelled myth, not because they were false, but because their original reference had slipped beneath recognition. What is rarely asked is why flood stories endure when so many other ancient narratives fade. Perhaps because they encode a lesson that never becomes obsolete, that the world can reset without asking permission, and that survival depends as much on letting go as on holding fast. There is also a subtler pattern within these accounts. The survivors are rarely portrayed as conquerors or builders of empires. They are caretakers, carriers, figures tasked not with domination, but with remembrance. This emphasis suggests that what was feared most was not physical destruction, but the loss of continuity. If that fear was justified, then the memory of repeated inundation may have shaped early human priorities deeply. Mobility would have been valued over permanence, oral tradition over fixed record, redundancy over accumulation. These choices would make societies resilient, but archaeologically invisible. Over time, as waters stabilized and shorelines settled into recognizable forms, new communities would emerge inland. Their ancestors' stories would persist, but their contexts would not. Without visible ruins to anchor them, these narratives would feel abstract, symbolic, easy to reinterpret. Later civilizations, encountering these stories without geological understanding, would reshape them again. Moral frameworks would be layered atop environmental memory. Punishment would replace process. Divine intention would replace climatic mechanism. The story would survive, but its original meaning would drift further away. What remains haunting is not whether these stories describe a single flood or many. It is the implication that loss on a planetary scale was familiar enough to be remembered everywhere, that forgetting was not an exception, but an expectation. This challenges the comforting notion that humanity steadily accumulates wisdom. Instead, it suggests cycles of knowing and unknowing, periods when memory expands, followed by contractions so severe that only compressed symbols survive. In this light, myth becomes not fiction, but residue. There is a temptation to search for a single source, a single drowned civilization whose destruction seeded all later legends. But this may be another simplification. Repetition does not require origin, it requires recurrence. Similar conditions produce similar responses. Similar losses produce similar stories. If human communities repeatedly found themselves watching familiar land vanish beneath water, they would repeatedly encode that experience into narrative. Each telling would be shaped by local context, but the core sensation would remain intact. Over time, this would produce a global chorus rather than a single voice. As you sit with these thoughts, imagine generations living with the expectation of erasure, teaching children not only how to hunt or gather, but how to release attachment, how to move when the ground betrays you, how to carry meaning lightly enough that it can survive relocation. In such a world, permanence would feel dangerous. Stability would be suspect. Knowledge would be designed to travel, not to anchor. What we now interpret as simplicity may have been an advanced response to an unstable planet. And when, eventually, stability returned for longer spans, those habits would not vanish overnight. The reflex to avoid permanence would linger. Only gradually would humans risk building structures meant to last. Only gradually would memory externalize again. This leaves a final, uneasy question hovering at the edge of this layer. If our earliest stories are shaped by repeated loss, if they carry warnings rather than triumphs, then what else might they be telling us? Not about the past, but about patterns that have not finished repeating. If the silence before history is filled with water and movement, with departure rather than construction, then perhaps history begins not when humans learn to build, but when they dare to believe the world will stay long enough to remember what they make. As the waters receded and the land slowly learned new outlines, memory did not return evenly. Some things resurfaced quickly. Practical skills, seasonal rhythms, the language of survival. Other things remained submerged, not physically, but cognitively. Knowledge once held in shared continuity returned fragmented, uneven, sometimes distorted beyond recognition. It is here that another strangeness begins to emerge. When early civilizations finally step into what we call history, they do not behave like societies discovering the world for the first time. They behave like inheritors, not of specific instructions perhaps, but of expectations, of assumptions about order, symmetry and meaning that feel older than the structures in which they appear. Consider the sudden appearance of sophisticated orientation. Across early centers of civilization, structures align with cardinal directions and celestial cycles with striking precision. This is often attributed to careful observation over time, and yet observation alone does not produce consensus. To align a society around the sky requires shared frameworks, shared symbols, and shared reasons for caring. Such alignment implies continuity of attention across generations. It implies a tradition of watching the heavens, of mapping patterns, of transmitting significance. But where is the long record of that learning? Where are the experimental phases, the mistakes, the gradual corrections? Instead, what appears is confidence, as though the sky was already familiar. This confidence extends beyond astronomy. Early mathematical systems emerge not as crude approximations, but as structured abstractions. Counting gives way quickly to ratios. Geometry appears embedded in architecture without written explanation. These are not the tools of beginners. They are the tools of people refining something they already trust. Language reflects a similar depth. The earliest written systems do not record casual speech. They encode administration, ritual, cosmology. They assume complex grammar already in place. Writing does not capture language as it forms, but as it solidifies. Everything before remains invisible. If all of this developed independently and recently, the compression is remarkable. But if these systems are re-expressions of older cognitive frameworks, shaped and reshaped through cycles of loss, their sudden clarity becomes easier to understand. What appears new may simply be stable enough to surface again. This interpretation does not require a lost golden age or advanced prehistoric empires. It requires only repetition. Enough cycles of forgetting and remembering that certain patterns become ingrained, even when their origins are obscured. The mind carries them forward, even when material culture does not. There is also the uncomfortable question of selection. Not everything that existed was remembered. What resurfaced were systems compatible with new conditions, denser populations, fixed settlements, emerging hierarchies. Other ways of knowing may have been incompatible with permanence and thus quietly discarded. In this sense, history may not represent the full spectrum of human intelligence, but a narrow band that survived a particular transition. The move towards sedentary life, storage, and centralized control favoured certain cognitive styles over others. What did not adapt was not necessarily inferior, it was simply misaligned. This raises the possibility that early humans possessed forms of understanding that left little trace because they were not designed to endure. Knowledge tied to movement, landscape, sound, or presence does not fossilize well. When the social context that sustained it collapsed, it vanished without residue. Over time, new systems rose that favoured durability. Stone over voice, symbol over gesture, record over memory. These systems proved effective at preserving certain kinds of information. They also reshaped what was considered valuable to know. History, in this light, is not a neutral archive. It is a filter. What passes through that filter are things that can be stored, counted, and standardized. What remains behind are things that require lived continuity. When continuity breaks often enough, those things disappear first. Not because they are unimportant, but because they are fragile. This fragility complicates our attempts to reconstruct the past. We look for what we understand how to recognize. We measure complexity by permanence. And when permanence is absent, we infer simplicity. This inference may say more about our tools than about early humanity. There are moments when this bias becomes visible. When researchers encounter evidence that does not fit the expected sequence, it is often described as premature or anomalous, too early, too advanced, as though time itself had made a mistake. The anomaly is contained, explained away, or isolated. But anomalies accumulate quietly. Each one alone is manageable. Together they suggest that the underlying model may be incomplete. That history's beginning is not a clean line, but a convergence point where multiple long threads briefly become visible. If this is so, then what we call the dawn of civilization may be less a birth than a narrowing. A moment when humanity commits to a particular way of remembering itself, leaving other ways behind. Writing triumphs over song, monument over movement, line over circle. This commitment brings undeniable power. It allows coordination at scale. It allows accumulation across generations. It allows control. But it also introduces amnesia. Once memory is externalized, internal memory atrophies. Once permanence is assumed, adaptability weakens. As you rest with these thoughts, imagine standing at that narrowing point. Behind you, countless human lives unfolding in patterns too fluid to preserve. Ahead of you, a world where memory hardens, where time becomes segmented, where forgetting takes new forms. What was gained is obvious, what was lost remains unnamed, and so the question lingers, unresolved but insistent. If history begins where certain kinds of memory become stable, what forms of human understanding were sacrificed to make that stability possible? And how different might our present feel if those older ways of knowing had not slipped so quietly beneath the surface of time? There are moments when stone appears to listen, not in the way ears listen, but in the way a surface receives pressure, rhythm, repetition. When humans carve, stack, or balance rock, they do more than arrange matter. They impose timing, they embed intention into weight, and sometimes the result suggests an understanding that feels deeper than construction alone. Across early sites there is a recurring sensitivity to sound, resonance, and vibration, chambers that amplify low frequencies, corridors that guide echoes, surfaces that respond differently depending on where one stands or speaks. These features are often dismissed as incidental, as the byproduct of material and space, but repetition across cultures weakens that dismissal. Accidents do not repeat with such consistency. Sound is among the most ancient tools humans possess. Before writing, before agriculture, before even complex tools, there was voice, rhythm, chant, the ability to alter consciousness through vibration alone. These capacities do not leave direct traces, but their architectural companions might. If early societies understood sound as a means of orientation, a way to synchronize groups, induce shared states, or mark transitions, then certain structures begin to look less like shelters and more like instruments. Not instruments for performance, but for alignment, of bodies, of attention, of memory. What is striking is how early some of these features appear. In places traditionally dated to the beginnings of settled life, stonework already exhibits acoustic intentionality. This implies not experimentation, but confidence, as though the builders knew what effect they were seeking, even if they didn't record how they learned to seek it. Acoustics, unlike tools, cannot be learned in isolation. They require bodies in space, repetition over time, feedback. One must notice how sound behaves, how it interacts with enclosure, how it affects emotion and perception. This kind of knowledge develops slowly. It is refined communally. And once learned, it is transmitted through practice rather than explanation. If that transmission breaks, the knowledge vanishes almost completely. A wall remains, a chamber remains. But the understanding of why it was shaped that way dissolves. Future observers may inherit the structure without inheriting its use. Stone becomes mute, even if it was once responsive. This pattern may help explain why certain ancient sites feel enigmatic rather than incomplete. They are not ruins of unfinished ideas. They are intact expressions of systems we no longer participate in. We stand inside them without knowing how to activate the context that made them meaningful. The same may be true of scale. Early stone constructions often involve blocks whose movement seems excessive by modern assumptions. Why invest such energy in mass when smaller materials would suffice? The answer may lie not in strength, but in stability. Heavier stone holds vibration differently. It anchors resonance. It persists. If knowledge was meant to be enacted rather than stored, then building environments that facilitated enactment would be logical. The structure becomes a mnemonic, a place where certain states can be recalled through presence rather than description. Remove the practice and the mnemonic becomes unreadable. Over time, as societies shift toward externalized memory, these environments lose their function. What remains is impressive craftsmanship stripped of context. The question then becomes not how such structures were built, but why they were built in the first place. Modern frameworks often default to utility or power, temples, tombs, displays of authority. But these interpretations assume hierarchical societies projecting dominance. They struggle to account for features that seem designed for subtlety rather than spectacle, for internal experience rather than outward control. There is a quieter possibility. That early humans invested in spaces that facilitated coherence, places where groups could synchronize perception, reinforce shared narratives, or recalibrate after disruption. In unstable worlds, such coherence would be essential, not as ideology, but as survival. If so, then the disappearance of these practices marks not just a loss of technique, but a shift in how humans related to themselves. When memory moves from body to object, from sound to mark, from presence to permanence, the need for such spaces diminishes. The world becomes legible in different ways. This transition would not be clean. For a time, old and new systems would coexist. Stone would still be shaped for resonance even as writing emerged elsewhere. Gradually, however, the balance would tip. Sound would give way to symbol, participation to observation, experience to record. What is left behind is ambiguous, structures that feel purposeful but inaccessible, alignments whose logic is partially visible but incomplete, precision without explanation. It is tempting to fill these gaps with grand claims or dismissive skepticism. Both responses miss the same point. The point is that human intelligence has always expressed itself through context. When context dissolves, intelligence becomes invisible, not absent but unreadable. As you imagine these spaces in their original use, filled not with tourists or silence but with bodies, breath, rhythm, you may sense how much of early humanity's interior life escapes reconstruction. not because it was primitive, but because it was experiential. And if that is true, then our picture of human origins is shaped less by what existed and more by what survived translation. Stone can cross millennia. Sound cannot. Gesture cannot. Shared attention cannot. The narrowing continues. Each step toward permanence trades one form of knowing for another. Each gain carries a loss so quiet it is mistaken for inevitability. The lingering question at this layer is not whether early humans possessed advanced understanding, but how many dimensions of that understanding were never meant to endure, and how our own reliance on durability may be blinding us to forms of intelligence that leave no lasting mark, yet shape everything that follows. What remains unseen often shapes understanding more than what is found. The eighth layer settles into this negative space, where absence itself becomes a form of evidence. Not absence as failure, but absence as pattern. The kind that repeats too consistently to be ignored. Archaeology by nature works with fragments. It reconstructs worlds from what endured longest: stone, bone, fired clay. Organic life dissolves, sound disappears, movement leaves no imprint. Over time, this selective survival begins to masquerade as completeness. We forget that what we excavate is not what existed, but what resisted erasure. There are moments when this selective vision becomes obvious. Entire regions show long gaps in occupation that do not align with environmental capacity. Landscapes that could have supported life appear empty for thousands of years, only to repopulate suddenly. The usual explanation points to migration. People left. People returned. But migration without trace raises its own questions. Humans do not vanish without residue. Even mobile groups leave scatter, hearths, tool fragments, burial traces. When none appear, the silence becomes conspicuous. Either people truly were not there, or they lived in ways that did not translate into durable debris. Both possibilities are unsettling. The second possibility challenges a foundational assumption, that complexity always leaves clutter, that societies must accumulate material excess to be legible. But what if some systems were designed to minimize residue? What if they prioritized adaptability over accumulation, leaving behind almost nothing once the people moved on? Ethnographic parallels hint at this possibility. Some societies organize life around impermanence deliberately. Structures are temporary. Tools are shared and recycled. Landscapes are treated as partners rather than resources to be reshaped. When such societies dissolve or relocate, their material signature fades rapidly. Scale this behavior backward into deep time, across repeated disruptions, and the archaeological record would thin dramatically. Entire lifeways could pass through millennia, leaving behind little more than subtle soil disturbances, indistinguishable from natural variation. What complicates matters further is the way excavation itself functions. We dig where we expect to find. We search where previous finds suggest promise. Entire categories of potential evidence remain unexplored simply because they do not fit predictive models. Absence then reinforces expectation, creating a feedback loop of invisibility. This is not negligence, it is limitation. Tools shape questions, methods shape results. When we rely on durability as a proxy for importance, we systematically overlook forms of intelligence that resist durability. Consider the human body itself. Posture, breath control, rhythmic movement. These are learned systems. They require training and transmission. They shape cognition and emotion, and they leave no trace. If early societies invested heavily in embodied knowledge, archaeology would register little of their sophistication. The same is true of social structure. Consensus-based organization, fluid leadership, distributed responsibility. These arrangements do not fossilize. They leave no palaces, no thrones, no administrative archives. From the outside, such societies appear simple. From within, they may be finely tuned. Even technology can evade detection. Materials like wood, fibre, leather and plant-based compounds degrade rapidly. A world built largely from these would disappear almost entirely. What remains would be the exceptions, not the norm. Over time, the accumulation of exceptions begins to distort perception. Stone tools become central not because they were most important, but because they survived. Architecture becomes a marker of advancement not because it defines intelligence, but because it persists. This inversion quietly reshapes narratives of origin. The question then shifts from what we have found to what we have lost without noticing. How many cycles of human organisation pass beneath the threshold of detectability? How many ways of living were fully functional, meaningful, and complete, yet left no footprint heavy enough to be recognised later? There is a subtle arrogance embedded in the assumption that history begins where evidence becomes abundant, as though existence requires witnesses, as though meaning must be legible to be real. This assumption privileges our present tools over past realities. What if early humanity understood impermanence not as failure, but as alignment? If the world changes unpredictably, then building lightly makes sense. If memory is fragile, then embedding it in people rather than objects becomes logical. If loss is expected, then flexibility becomes wisdom. Such strategies would optimize survival at the cost of legibility. They would produce humans capable of enduring disruption, but invisible to future reconstruction. The silence before history may therefore reflect success, not deficiency. This interpretation reframes the narrative of progress. Instead of a slow ascent from ignorance to knowledge, it becomes a series of trade-offs. Visibility increases as resilience decreases. Permanence grows as adaptability narrows. What we gain in record, we may lose in range. As societies become more anchored, more invested in fixed structures and stored memory, they also become more vulnerable to large-scale disruption. When collapse comes, it is deeper. Loss is more total. The archaeological layers thicken, but the recovery slows. Seen this way, the thinness of early layers is not puzzling, it is expected. What is puzzling is how readily we accept thinness as emptiness. As you hold this thought, imagine standing on a landscape that once supported human life for thousands of years, now appearing untouched. No ruins, no monuments, just terrain. The temptation is to see nothing. But perhaps what is missing is not presence, but permission to recognize it. The earth does not remember everything, it remembers selectively, and what it forgets may tell us as much about human origins as what it preserves. The question that lingers at the edge of this absence is quiet but persistent. If so much of early humanity's complexity was designed to disappear, how much of our own understanding is shaped by what refuses to vanish? And what kinds of intelligence might we still be overlooking because they leave no lasting mark? When what came before becomes unreachable, it often returns wearing faces. The ninth layer drifts into this strange territory where memory takes human form, where knowledge appears not as inheritance but as visitation. Across cultures, there are figures who arrive from elsewhere, already knowing what others do not. They teach, they reorder, and then they leave. These figures are described differently depending on where they appear. Sometimes they are gods, sometimes ancestors, sometimes strangers emerging from the sea or descending from the sky. Their names change, their garments shift, their moral tone varies, but their function remains strikingly consistent. They arrive after disruption. They restore orientation. They do not invent from nothing. They remind. Modern interpretations often collapse these stories into mythology, reading them as symbolic expressions of natural forces or social transitions. This approach is not wrong, but it may be incomplete. Symbols do not arise arbitrarily. They condense experience. They preserve relational memory long after details dissolve. If early humanity experienced repeated collapses of continuity, then the idea of knowledge arriving from elsewhere becomes psychologically coherent. After forgetting, remembering feels external. What once belonged to the group returns unfamiliar, carrying authority precisely because its origin is obscured. In such moments, the past becomes other. It is no longer something one recalls, but something one encounters. The teacher figure emerges not because knowledge is new, but because its lineage has been broken. Instruction requires personification when continuity fails. This pattern appears again and again. A being who knows the seasons, who understands agriculture, law, or the stars, who brings order without claiming ownership. Often, these figures do not rule. They instruct, then withdraw. Their departure is as important as their arrival. They do not anchor power, they re-establish balance. What is curious is how often these figures are associated with thresholds, shorelines, mountaintops, caves, crossings, places of transition rather than settlement. This suggests not conquest, but emergence, not invasion, but reappearance. If these stories preserve compressed memory of post-collapse reorganization, then their consistency begins to make sense. After disruption, groups must rebuild coherence quickly. Those who retain fragments of older knowledge would hold disproportionate influence. Over time, their role would elevate. Memory would mythologize them. This does not require literal immortals or external beings. It requires a symmetry of knowledge in moments of fragility. Survivors who remember more than others. Elders who carry fragments of lost systems. Outsiders whose traditions survive different disruptions. In retelling, these distinctions harden into categories beyond human scale. The danger in dismissing these accounts entirely is that it erases how memory actually functions under stress. Trauma does not preserve detail, it preserves pattern. It exaggerates what feels stabilizing. Over generations, the stabilizer becomes sacred. There is also a moral dimension embedded in these narratives. The teachers often warn. They speak of cycles. They emphasize humility. They remind communities that order is conditional. This suggests lived experience rather than abstract morality. A lesson learned through loss, not speculation. If these stories originated in real processes of recovery after collapse, then their persistence reflects utility. They remind societies that stability is temporary, that knowledge must be respected, that forgetting carries cost. Myth becomes a mnemonic device for vulnerability. What complicates the picture further is how these figures fade as permanence increases. In later historical periods, teachers become kings, guides become rulers, knowledge centralizes, authority consolidates. The transitional figure disappears because continuity has been restored. Memory no longer needs to arrive from elsewhere. It can be inherited again. This shift is subtle but important. It marks the moment when societies stop expecting rupture as normal, when they begin to assume the future will resemble the present closely enough to justify accumulation. The teacher who leaves is replaced by institutions that stay. But institutions, unlike travelers, resist adaptation. They depend on stability. When disruption returns, as it inevitably does, they fracture more violently. The cycle resets, but the memory of earlier resets may already be too diluted to guide response. Seen this way, the figures who arrive and depart are not anomalies, they are symptoms. They signal periods when humanity was forced to reassemble itself from fragments, relying on residual knowledge rather than continuous tradition. There is a quiet tragedy embedded in this pattern. Each reset reduces the resolution of memory, each retelling simplifies. What was once procedural becomes moral. What was once practical becomes sacred. Eventually the original function is lost entirely, leaving only reverence. And yet something essential persists. The sense that knowledge is older than the present moment, that wisdom did not begin here, that what feels new may be a rearrangement of something ancient. As you reflect on these narratives, consider how often modern societies frame innovation as creation rather than recovery. How often progress is imagined as forward motion rather than reorientation. This bias may blind us to how much of what we discover has been known before, then lost. If human origins are marked not by a single awakening but by repeated reawakenings, then the presence of these guiding figures becomes less mysterious. They are echoes of continuity attempting to reassert itself in fractured worlds. The lingering question at this layer is not whether such teachers existed as described, but why humanity repeatedly imagines knowledge arriving from outside itself. What does that say about our relationship with our own past, and how much of what we attribute to external sources may, in fact, be remnants of ourselves, returning in forms we no longer recognize? If memory must wear a mask to be heard, then perhaps history is not the story of what we learned, but of how often we forgot, and how creatively we tried to remember again. When continuity thins, patterns begin to carry the burden of memory. Not stories, not names, but shapes, motifs that repeat because they survive translation. The 10th layer settles into these quiet recurrences, symbols that appear far apart in time and place, echoing one another without explanation, as though they were fragments of a language no longer spoken aloud. Certain forms return with unsettling regularity, spirals traced into stone, crossed lines marking cardinal directions, circles divided by axes, waves carved into rock faces far from water. These shapes are often treated as decorative or symbolic in isolation. Yet when viewed together, they begin to resemble a grammar rather than ornament. Symbols are not arbitrary. They condense experience into portable form. They compress relationships between sky and ground, movement and stillness, life and return. A symbol that persists across cultures does so because it performs a function that remains useful even when context changes. It is remembered not because it is beautiful, but because it works. What is striking is how early many of these motifs appear. Long before writing, before formal mathematics, humans were marking surfaces with geometry, not representation, but abstraction. This suggests a comfort with conceptual thinking that predates our usual markers of complexity. It suggests that humans were already thinking in systems. Geometry, after all, is not learned by accident. It emerges from attention to regularity. The repetition of seasons, the arc of the sun, the rhythm of growth and decay. To abstract these into shape is to externalize observation into memory. A spiral is not a picture of something, it is a behavior made visible. If early societies relied on such symbols to transmit understanding across generations, then their survival becomes less mysterious. They are compact. They require no language. They can be rediscovered through use rather than instruction. A child tracing a spiral does not need to know its name to inherit its rhythm. Over time, however, symbols detach from their original contexts. They migrate. They accumulate new meanings. They are repurposed. What remains consistent is their structure, not their interpretation. The same form can represent fertility in one place, time in another, the cosmos in a third. This flexibility ensures survival, but it obscures origin. The danger lies in mistaking this obscurity for emptiness. When we encounter a symbol without explanation, we often treat it as decoration or belief rather than knowledge. We assume that meaning begins where explanation does, but explanation is a late invention. Understanding does not always announce itself. There is evidence that early symbolic systems were not meant to be read linearly. They were enacted, walked, circled, repeated. Their meaning emerged through participation rather than decoding. This kind of knowledge resists capture by static analysis. Remove the movement, and the symbol flattens. As society shifted toward written records, symbols hardened into signs. They became references rather than processes. This shift brought clarity at the cost of depth. What was once experienced became described. What was once lived became taught. The symbol remained, but its function narrowed. In this narrowing, something subtle was lost. Symbols stopped teaching through doing and began teaching through assertion. Authority replaced exploration. Interpretation replaced participation. The pattern survived, but the invitation faded. This may explain why certain motifs feel simultaneously familiar and inaccessible. They resonate without revealing why. They evoke a sense of recognition that cannot be articulated, as though the body remembers something the mind cannot name. If these symbols originated in periods of repeated disruption, they may have served as anchors, minimal structures capable of carrying maximum continuity. When stories fractured and practices dissolved, symbols could persist. They did not require infrastructure. They required only attention. This reframes their persistence as intentional rather than accidental. Not relics of superstition, but tools of resilience. Ways to carry orientation through instability. When everything else dissolves, shape remains. The global recurrence of these forms may then reflect not diffusion from a single source, but convergence under similar pressures. Different societies facing similar losses distill experience into similar compressions. The same problems produce the same minimal solutions, yet convergence alone does not explain the depth of similarity. Some patterns align not only in form, but in placement and proportion. They appear at thresholds, at centres, at boundaries. They map relationships rather than objects. This suggests a shared cognitive strategy rather than coincidence. If early humanity developed a symbolic toolkit optimized for survival through forgetting, then much of that toolkit would remain invisible to us. We search for texts, we search for tools, we search for structures. We do not often search for patterns that require enactment to understand. This invisibility feeds a misconception that symbolism emerges late, after material stability. But perhaps symbolism emerges early, precisely because stability cannot be assumed. When the world shifts unpredictably, abstraction becomes essential. It allows meaning to move when place cannot. As you linger with these shapes, imagine them not as static carvings but as invitations, paths to be walked, cycles to be repeated, orientations to be rehearsed. Their persistence may not signal belief but rehearsal, a way of keeping certain understandings alive without naming them. If so, then the symbolic layer of early humanity represents a form of intelligence optimized for loss, knowledge that can survive without explanation, memory that can be reactivated without instruction, wisdom that waits patiently for conditions to allow its return. This patience may be what unsettles us. Symbols do not argue, they do not prove, they simply endure. They offer themselves to each generation without insisting on being understood, and when they are finally forgotten, they leave little trace of what they once carried. The question that settles at the edge of this layer is not whether these symbols hide secret messages, but whether they were ever meant to be decoded at all. What if their purpose was not to convey information, but to preserve orientation, a way of staying human when everything familiar dissolves? If meaning can be compressed into shape, then history's silence may not be empty. It may be speaking in a language we no longer know how to listen to. Time itself becomes unstable when memory fractures. Not unstable in the sense of chaos, but elastic, stretched, compressed, folded in ways that resist simple measurement. The 11th layer enters this tension, where chronology begins to blur, and where the past refuses to behave like a straight line. In many early traditions, time is not counted so much as inhabited. It moves in cycles, returns, seasons, ages that repeat rather than progress. This stands in quiet contrast to the modern insistence on linear sequence, where each moment replaces the last and never returns. Neither conception is inherently false, but each reveals different priorities. When history is young, time tends to feel circular. Events recur. Patterns matter more than dates. What matters is not when something happened, but how it fits within a rhythm. This orientation makes sense in worlds shaped by repetition. seasons, migrations, climatic cycles. It also makes sense in worlds where collapse is familiar. If things fall apart regularly, then beginnings lose their finality. Some ancient records, sparse and enigmatic, preserve this elasticity in unsettling ways. Lists of rulers whose reigns stretch far beyond biological plausibility. Ages measured in vast spans that resist literal interpretation. Scholars often treat these as symbolic exaggeration or theological metaphor. Yet even metaphor chooses its scale deliberately. If early societies experienced time as layered rather than linear, then long durations may not have represented individual lifespans at all. They may have encoded continuity, the persistence of roles, offices, or traditions across generations. Time, in this sense, marks endurance rather than sequence. This interpretation is often overlooked because it conflicts with later administrative needs. Once writing becomes a tool of governance, time must be standardized. Taxation, inheritance, law, all require precise sequence. Elastic time becomes inconvenient. It is replaced with countable units. Years are numbered. Histories are anchored. But before this anchoring, memory may have operated differently. Events were not placed in order so much as situated in relation. One thing happened during the time of abundance, another during the age of cold, another during the reign of forgetting. These are not dates, they are states. Such a system preserves meaning rather than detail. It allows communities to recognize conditions even when specifics change. But it also makes translation difficult. When later readers encounter these records, they attempt to convert states into numbers. The result feels absurd. Lifespans stretch impossibly. Timelines distort. Rather than asking whether these records are false, it may be more revealing to ask what kind of truth they were designed to carry. Not factual sequence, but experiential continuity. Not who ruled when, but how long a pattern persisted before it broke. If humanity endured multiple cycles of collapse and recovery, then time itself would be experienced unevenly. Periods of stability would feel expansive. Periods of crisis would compress. Memory would cluster around transitions rather than durations. The past would not feel like a road, but like a terrain marked by thresholds. This terrain-like experience of time aligns with other patterns already observed. Knowledge returning suddenly, structures appearing fully formed, traditions re-emerging without visible development. All of these suggest that the past is not lost evenly, but unevenly. Some things sink deep, others float back quickly. When linear chronology dominates, these patterns appear anomalous, but under a cyclical or layered conception of time, they become expected. What matters is not continuous accumulation, but resonance. Ideas survive not by being preserved intact, but by aligning with recurring conditions. This may explain why certain insights appear repeatedly across cultures without direct transmission. They are rediscovered because the conditions that generated them recur. The mind, facing familiar constraints, arrives at familiar solutions. Time becomes less a line of inheritance and more a field of reactivation. The shift toward a linear time marks a profound change in human self-understanding. It implies progress, irreversibility, accumulation. It also implies loss. Once time moves forward relentlessly, forgetting becomes permanent. What falls behind cannot be returned to. The past becomes fixed rather than revisitable. This fixation may be comforting. It allows for closure. It allows for narrative. But it also narrows possibility. If the past is closed, then wisdom can only be found ahead. If cycles are denied, then repetition becomes mistake rather than reminder. As linear time asserts itself, history begins to harden. Chronology replaces memory. Sequence replaces pattern. What does not fit is labelled myth, exaggeration, error. The earlier elasticity is smoothed away, yet traces remain. They surface in inconsistencies, in records that refuse to align, in stories that feel temporally displaced, in the sense that something has happened before, even when evidence suggests it has not. These traces unsettle because they threaten the authority of the timeline. They suggest that the past is not fully captured by dates, that history may be layered beneath history, accessible only indirectly. As you reflect on this elasticity, consider how your own experience of time shifts under stress, how moments of danger stretch, how periods of stability blur, how memory clusters around transitions rather than durations. The human mind does not experience time evenly. Why should early humanity have done so? If prehistory was shaped by repeated disruption, then time would not feel like accumulation. It would feel like return. The question would not be what comes next, but what comes back. This orientation changes how origins are understood. There is no single beginning. There are many restarts. Each one feels like the first because memory before it has thinned beyond reach. In this light, the silence before history is not a void, but a compression. Time folded so tightly that sequence dissolves into pattern. What survives are not dates, but rhythms. The unresolved question at this layer is quiet but destabilizing. If time itself was once experienced differently, then how much of what we call ancient error is actually a mismatch between their way of remembering and our way of measuring? And if so, what other truths have we flattened simply because they refuse to move in a straight line? When memory becomes external, it gains durability at the cost of vulnerability. The 12th layer turns toward this exchange, toward the moments when knowledge leaves the body and enters objects, and how easily those objects can be lost, broken, or deliberately undone. Writing is often described as humanity's safeguard against forgetting, and in many ways it is. Marks on clay, ink on fibre, incisions in stone. These things persist when voices do not. But permanence is never neutral. The moment knowledge can be stored, it can also be controlled, selected, withheld, destroyed. Early archives were not public spaces. They belonged to temples, courts, or specialized classes. Access was limited. Interpretation was guided. What was recorded was not the sum of what was known, but what was deemed necessary to preserve. This selectivity shapes history as much as any catastrophe. There are recurring accounts of collections that once existed and no longer do. Libraries described only after they vanished. Texts cited but never recovered. Entire systems of knowledge referenced as though they were familiar, yet absent from the record. These gaps are often treated as accidents of time, fires, floods, neglect, but absence can also result from intention. Knowledge confers power, it stabilizes hierarchies, it threatens them. At different moments, authorities have chosen to erase what they could not integrate. Not to suppress truth in a dramatic sense, but to simplify, to reduce ambiguity, to align memory with governance. This does not require malice, it requires preference. When continuity is fragile, clarity becomes valuable. Contradictory accounts create instability. Complex origins invite dissent. A clean beginning, even if incomplete, is easier to maintain. As a result, history often emerges trimmed, edges softened, variants discarded. What remains feels coherent, but coherence is achieved through subtraction. The deeper past, with its cycles and ambiguities, becomes inconvenient. It is easier to draw a line and declare that everything meaningful begins here. This process repeats across cultures. New regimes inherit old records and decide which ones matter. Religious movements adopt certain texts and reject others. Scholars standardize canons. Over time, the excluded material does not merely disappear, it becomes unimaginable. Future generations do not ask about it because they do not know it was ever there. The danger of externalized memory is not that it can be destroyed, but that it can be curated until alternatives vanish. Oral traditions fracture when they lose institutional support. Practices dissolve when their contexts are outlawed or neglected. What survives does so not necessarily because it is true, but because it is allowed. There are moments in history where this selectivity becomes visible, sudden shifts in cosmology, abrupt theological simplifications, legal reforms that redefine time, lineage, or identity. These changes often coincide with consolidation of power. Memory is reorganized to support the present. What is rarely acknowledged is how much this reorganization depends on the fragility of early records. Clay tablets break, papyrus decays, scrolls burn. A few decisive events can reshape the archive for centuries. What follows feels like tradition, even if it is reconstruction. If early humanity relied on multiple overlapping systems of memory, embodied, oral, symbolic, then the loss of any one would narrow understanding. As writing rose to dominance, other forms were gradually devalued. What could not be written was treated as less real. This devaluation had consequences. Knowledge tied to rhythm, movement, or direct experience became harder to justify. Practices that resisted codification were marginalized. Over time, the archive came to represent not the breadth of human knowing, but the subset that could be fixed. The result is a historical record that feels solid but incomplete. It speaks with confidence, but from a narrow channel. What lies outside that channel appears as noise, myth, or superstition. The possibility that something essential was lost is acknowledged briefly, then set aside. And yet the sense of loss persists. It appears as unease, as questions that return without answers, as the feeling that humanity stepped into history carrying more than it admits, then set parts of itself down without marking the place. This is not an accusation against any single institution or era. It is a structural consequence of how memory is preserved. Externalization creates survival, but also creates dependency. When the medium becomes central, meaning becomes vulnerable to the medium's fate. As you sit with this layer, imagine knowledge not as a possession, but as a current. It flows through bodies, practices, environments. Writing dams the current, stores it, channels it. This allows accumulation. It also allows stagnation. When dams break, floods follow. When they hold too long, upstream dries out. Balance is difficult, and in early history, the balance shifted repeatedly. Each shift left residue, texts without context, practices without explanation, symbols without voice. What we inherit is therefore not a complete memory but a shaped one, the past filtered through survival, preference, and power. The deeper currents remain, but they move beneath the surface, sensed rather than seen. The unresolved question here is not whether knowledge was lost. Loss is inevitable. But how much of our understanding of human origins rests on what survived selection rather than what once existed, and whether, by relying so heavily on what was written, we have mistaken durability for completeness. If history is the story that endured, then prehistory may be the story that could not be held in the forms we chose to keep, and what slips through those forms may still be shaping us quietly from beyond the archive's reach. When memory is shaped, it is rarely done in silence. It happens through authority, quiet, persistent, often invisible. The 13th layer turns toward this presence, not as a villain, but as a force that organizes remembrance by deciding what is useful to retain. Every society, once it grows dense enough, develops mechanisms to stabilize itself. Laws, rituals, classifications, calendars. These are not merely tools of control. They are tools of survival. They reduce uncertainty. They create predictability. They allow strangers to coordinate without knowing one another. But stability demands simplification. Too many competing narratives strain coherence. Too many origins weaken legitimacy. For power to endure, the past must appear settled. Not necessarily true in every detail, but consistent enough to support the present. This is where memory begins to narrow deliberately. not erased outright, but streamlined. Contradictions are softened. Alternative accounts are labelled peripheral. What does not fit the dominant structure is allowed to fade through neglect rather than suppression. This process leaves no clear fingerprints. There is rarely a single moment when history is rewritten. Instead, there are accumulations of small decisions. What is taught? What is copied? What is translated? What is commented on? Over time, these preferences harden into tradition. Once a narrative becomes traditional, it acquires gravity. To question it feels destabilizing, even when evidence suggests incompleteness. Doubt becomes inconvenient. Curiosity becomes subversive. The past, instead of remaining open, begins to close. This closure is often framed as preservation, canonization, standardization. The creation of official histories is justified as protection against distortion. But protection always involves selection, and selection always involves exclusion. What disappears first are not facts, but ambiguities, stories that resist clear interpretation, accounts that suggest cycles rather than progress, memories that imply prior complexity rather than gradual ascent. These are not easily integrated into linear legitimizing frameworks. As institutions mature, they become invested in continuity. Their authority rests on the assumption that the present is the rightful outcome of the past. Anything that complicates that assumption threatens not just history but identity. This does not require conscious manipulation. Individuals within institutions act according to incentives. Clarity is rewarded. Consistency is praised. Complexity is postponed. Over generations, this bias accumulates into structural forgetting. The deeper past becomes simplified not because it is unimportant, but because it is dangerous. It raises questions about inevitability. It suggests alternatives. It implies that what exists now is not the only form humanity has taken, or could take again. Power prefers origins that justify hierarchy. Narratives that portray civilization as a rescue from chaos reinforce authority. If humanity was once lost and then saved by order, then order becomes sacred. Any suggestion that earlier societies may have been complex without hierarchy destabilizes that logic. This is why certain discoveries feel unsettling beyond their material implications. They do not merely add information, they threaten narrative foundations. They suggest that intelligence and organization are not dependent on centralized control, that coherence can exist without domination. Such implications are rarely confronted directly. Instead, they are softened through interpretation, exceptionalized, isolated, placed outside the main arc. The timeline remains intact even if patched. Over time, the boundary between history and prehistory becomes less a factual division and more a conceptual one. Prehistory becomes a space where anomalies can be placed without consequence, a zone of uncertainty that does not disturb the present. This division feels natural because it is old. It has been inherited. Questioning it feels like questioning reality itself, and yet it is precisely here that the deepest losses may have occurred. When authority stabilizes memory, it also stabilizes forgetting. What is not remembered cannot be demanded. What is not known cannot challenge. The past becomes a resource rather than a mirror. This is not unique to any culture or era. It is a structural feature of organized memory. Every system that preserves must also prune. The danger arises when pruning is mistaken for completeness. As you reflect on this, consider how often history is presented as settled knowledge rather than ongoing inquiry. How often origins are taught as conclusions rather than questions. This framing discourages exploration not through force, but through fatigue. Why search where nothing is supposed to exist? And yet, unease remains. It surfaces in persistent fascination with lost civilizations, forgotten ages, suppressed texts. These interests are often dismissed as romantic or conspiratorial, but beneath them lies a genuine intuition that the official story may be incomplete not because of deception, but because of structure. When systems grow powerful enough, they no longer need to lie, they only need to select. Silence becomes sufficient. This selection shapes not only what we know about the past, but how we imagine the future. If history is framed as a steady ascent, then decline feels impossible. If collapse is treated as anomaly, preparedness weakens. Memory becomes reassurance rather than instruction. But if the deeper past contains multiple rises and losses, then humility becomes rational. Adaptability becomes wisdom. The future reopens as something contingent rather than guaranteed. The 13th layer does not accuse, it observes. It notices how easily memory aligns with power and how quietly alternatives slip away. It recognizes that forgetting can be organized without ever being named. The question that lingers here is not who controlled history, but how control emerges naturally wherever continuity must be defended, and whether, by inheriting a narrowed past, we have also inherited a narrowed sense of what it means to be human, forgetting possibilities that once existed, not because they failed, but because they no longer served the story that came after. If the past has been trimmed to fit the present, then perhaps the most important work is not to restore a single lost truth, but to widen the frame again, to let uncertainty back in and allow memory to breathe beyond the boundaries it was given. As the frame narrows, the world grows quieter in unfamiliar ways, not because there is less to hear, but because fewer tones are permitted to resonate. The 14th layer moves through this narrowing, where complexity is not destroyed but simplified until it feels harmless. By the time history presents itself as a continuous story, much of what once resisted structure has already been softened. Cycles are straightened into lines, returns are reframed as progress. The past becomes a staircase rather than a field, each step justified by the one before it. This transformation is subtle. It does not announce itself as distortion. It feels like clarification, the removal of excess, the cleaning of noise. Ambiguity is reduced in the name of understanding. And yet, something essential is lost in the process. Not facts, but range. When the past is presented as a single trajectory, alternative forms of human organization become invisible. Ways of living that do not lead toward the present are treated as dead ends rather than viable paths. Their disappearance is interpreted as failure rather than choice. This framing reshapes how evidence is read. Discoveries that align with the established arc are integrated smoothly. Those that suggest divergence are treated cautiously. They are explained as transitional, incomplete, or marginal. The arc remains intact. Over time, this arc acquires emotional authority. It reassures. It implies inevitability. It suggests that the present is not just one outcome, but the correct one. This reassurance is comforting, especially in uncertain times. It reduces anxiety by implying that history knows where it is going. But reassurance comes at a cost. When the past is simplified, it stops instructing. It no longer warns. It becomes a celebration rather than a resource. Collapse becomes an exception. Loss becomes temporary. The idea that entire worlds can vanish without trace becomes unthinkable. This is why certain questions feel strangely uncomfortable. Not because they lack evidence, but because they threaten emotional equilibrium. To ask whether humanity has risen and fallen many times before is to unsettle the idea of progress. It introduces humility where confidence prefers to stand. The simplification of the past also reshapes imagination. Futures are modelled on what survived, not on what once existed. If the record favours permanence, then permanence becomes the goal. If the archive privileges hierarchy, then hierarchy feels natural. This influence operates quietly. It does not dictate belief. It shapes expectation. It limits what feels reasonable to imagine. Entire modes of being fall outside the horizon of plausibility simply because they left a little behind. In this sense, history does not merely describe humanity, it trains humanity. It teaches us what to value by showing us what endured. And when endurance becomes the measure of worth, adaptability begins to look like weakness. Yet adaptability may have been humanity's most refined skill. The ability to dissolve structures when conditions changed, to release memory when it became burdensome, to move lightly through worlds that did not promise stability. These skills do not leave monuments, they leave survivorship. They are written in the fact that humanity is still here, not in the thickness of its ruins. When history privileges what stands, it overlooks what moves. The narrowing becomes self-reinforcing. As fewer alternatives are remembered, fewer are imagined. As fewer are imagined, fewer are sought. The past becomes increasingly familiar, even when it is incomplete. Mystery recedes, replaced by comfort, and yet something resists this closure, a quiet dissatisfaction, a sense that the story is too neat, that it answers questions before they are fully asked. This dissatisfaction surfaces as curiosity about forgotten ages, submerged lands, suppressed texts. It is often dismissed as fantasy, but its persistence suggests an unmet need. That need may not be for secret knowledge, but for spaciousness, for a past that can hold contradiction without collapsing, for a human story that allows for multiple intelligences, multiple equilibria, multiple definitions of success. When history is allowed to be complex, the present loosens its grip. Identity becomes less rigid. The future opens. If humanity has taken many forms before, it may take others again. This possibility can feel destabilizing, but it can also feel relieving. The 14th layer does not argue for a specific alternative past. It questions the necessity of a single one. It asks whether our discomfort with ambiguity has led us to trade richness for certainty. As you rest within this thought, imagine history not as a completed sculpture, but as a landscape partially covered by fog. Some features are clear, others are suggested by shadow. Moving the fog does not require adding anything. It requires allowing uncertainty to exist without immediately resolving it. The danger of simplification is not error. It is overconfidence. When the past feels settled, the present feels justified. When the present feels justified, the future feels owed. And this sense of being owed stability can dull awareness of fragility. If earlier humanity learned through repeated loss, then forgetting that lesson may be our most serious inheritance. Not because collapse is inevitable, but because denial weakens response. Memory that warns is more valuable than memory that reassures. The narrowing of history may therefore be less about deception than about comfort. A shared agreement to remember what supports continuity and to forget what complicates it. This agreement is rarely spoken. It does not need to be. It is embedded in what is repeated and what is left aside. The question that settles at the end of this layer is quiet, but it lingers. If our understanding of human origins has been simplified to make the present feel stable, what vulnerabilities have we inherited along with that comfort? And what kinds of wisdom remain inaccessible as long as we mistake neatness for truth? In the stillness that follows, history feels less like a record and more like a breathing space, expanding and contracting with our willingness to tolerate what we do not fully know. At the edge of all this remembering and forgetting, something subtle remains. Not an answer, not a revelation, but a shift in posture. The 15th layer does not close the story. It loosens it, allowing the weight of what cannot be recovered to rest without urgency. If human history truly begins where memory stabilizes, then everything before it is not absence, but volatility. A long era in which being human meant adapting faster than remembering, responding faster than recording. In such a world, survival would not reward permanence, It would reward awareness, attention, the ability to sense change before it arrived fully. Seen from this angle, the silence before history is not a failure of intelligence. It is evidence of a different intelligence, one that did not assume the future would resemble the past closely enough to justify monuments, archives, or rigid systems. One that trusted presence more than preservation. This reframing does not romanticize early humanity. It does not turn loss into virtue. It simply recognizes constraint. When continuity is repeatedly broken, the instinct to externalize memory weakens. What cannot be carried safely is allowed to dissolve. What remains is distilled into behavior, pattern, orientation. Over time, as conditions stabilized, a new wager was made. Humans began to invest in durability again. They risked storing memory outside themselves. They built, wrote, counted, recorded. History emerged not as truth revealed, but as trust extended. Trust that the ground would hold long enough for memory to accumulate. That trust changed everything. It enabled scale. It enabled coordination across distance and time. It enabled power. It also introduced fragility of a new kind. When memory is external, its loss is catastrophic. When continuity depends on objects, collapse leaves deeper scars. Perhaps this is why the deep past feels haunting rather than merely distant. It reminds us of an alternative mode of being, one less visible, less legible, but possibly more resilient. A humanity that survived not by building upward, but by staying light enough to move when necessary. This is not an argument to return to that mode. The conditions that shaped it no longer exist in the same way. But forgetting that it existed at all may be dangerous. It narrows our imagination of what adaptation can look like. If the past contains many complete human worlds that left little trace, then our definition of civilization becomes provisional rather than absolute. What we value today, permanence, expansion, accumulation, may not be the only metrics of success. They may not even be the most important ones in all conditions. This realization carries a quiet humility. It suggests that humanity is not on a single trajectory, but within a field of possibilities. Some paths leave monuments, others leave descendants, some leave records, others leave instincts. What survives depends less on superiority than on compatibility with circumstance. Stone survives fire better than wood. Writing survives silence better than song. But survival is not the same as significance. As you sit with this final layer, imagine the countless human lives that unfolded fully without ever knowing they would be called prehistory. Lives that contained meaning, care, curiosity, grief, and joy. All the textures of being human, without leaving behind proof. Those lives do not need validation. They are not incomplete because they were not recorded. They are complete because they were lived. The tragedy, if there is one, lies not in their disappearance, but in our difficulty imagining them. History, then, is not the story of humanity beginning. It is the story of humanity choosing to remember itself in a particular way. A way that privileges stability over flexibility, accumulation over release, permanence over flow. This choice brought remarkable achievements. It also brought blind spots. It taught us to value what lasts and overlook what adapts. It taught us to equate visibility with importance, and in doing so it shaped how we understand our own origins. The deeper past resists this understanding not because it is empty, but because it does not cooperate with our expectations. It asks to be approached differently, not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a reminder of limits. There may never be a final account of what happened before history. No lost archive waiting to be uncovered, no single narrative capable of filling the silence completely. And perhaps that is not a failure of evidence, but a feature of reality. Some truths are not meant to be preserved intact. They are meant to be rediscovered when conditions align. They are meant to surface as intuition rather than instruction. as questions rather than answers? If so, then the purpose of looking backward is not to recover a definitive beginning, but to widen our sense of what being human has included, to loosen the certainty that our way is the culmination rather than one arrangement among many. In the quiet that follows this journey, history feels less like a wall behind us and more like a mist we are still moving through. Shapes appear, then fade. Some are clear, others remain indistinct. The urge to fix them all dissolves. What remains is awareness, a recognition that forgetting is not the opposite of knowing, but part of its rhythm, that humanity has always lived between memory and loss, adjusting its balance as the world demands. And perhaps the most important question is no longer what happened before history, but how we will be remembered, not in records or ruins, but in the choices we make about what deserves to endure and what we are willing to let go, trusting that being human has never required permanence to be real,